Hey there, Wally. Despite the Labor Day holiday, and I hope you had a good one, there is plenty to discuss this week. Of course, one of the interesting things that I wanted to share with folks, little personal story, just heading out of town. A lot of people are not flying these days. Wally, you haven't been out of New Mexico. I don't want to blow your cover or anything, but have you been out of New Mexico? Have you flown since the pandemic began?
No flying. I have driven outside of the state since then to a little square state to the north of New Mexico.
Yeah, well, this was my first flight out of state, and I took Southwest Airlines, which is my favorite airline. And I wanted to relay some, details about that because a lot of people, I think, haven't left the state. Meetings and events that they were planning to go to have been canceled, and folks are just staying closer to home, whether they choose that for themselves or it's chosen for them. And certainly, Governor Lujan Grisham has strongly encouraged folks to do things like that. But I have family in Ohio and went back and got out of the state. And it's interesting. Wallet Hub, as of their most recent report, says that Ohio is the 23rd most open state. New Mexico is the 34th most open state. But when you actually travel there, it feels like the difference between East and West Berlin. Ohio was much freer. Bars were open. Live music was going on. I even played pool in a public establishment, Wally. It was much more free and open. Indoor dining has been open for a while. Kids are going to school 5 days a week, albeit in masks at those public schools. If they choose, they have a virtual option for those who don't want to be in the school. So just a very different, much more open situation. I was a little hesitant, quite honestly, to fly. I mean, you're in a metal tube for several hours with a bunch of other people, and I just thought, boy, if there is a COVID friendly situation in terms of potentially picking up this virus, it's definitely being on a plane that's going to do it to you. But there wasn't so much as a cough on any of my flights through Chicago and down to Cincinnati. So a total of 4 different plane trips. Very comfortable. The airline, I have to give folks at Southwest credit. They left the middle seats open. Other than that, the planes were relatively full. I don't know how other airlines are doing. I haven't flown any of them yet, but Southwest Airlines did a bang up job, and it was an overall very good trip. And can't 100% guarantee that on the last flight I didn't pick up the Rona, but at this point I feel fine. There didn't seem to be any issues, and we'll just keep things updated. But wanted to give that report about my trip to Ohio, Wally.
Yeah, and when I was in Colorado, there are a lot more things open than in New Mexico, and I guess the biggest difference I saw relative to New Mexico is people out exercising. Um, there wasn't a mass to be had. I don't even, it's one of those, I wasn't exercising, so I didn't need to know what the rule was on my trip there. But, people out walking around outside, there were not masks to be found. When you go to restaurants, which are open, um, people would wear masks walking in and out, waiting in line in the restaurant. But I would just say it seemed like a much more relaxed situation than in New Mexico, in Colorado as well.
I agree with you. Didn't see a lot of people out just walking around with masks on. Certainly, stores, uh, walking into restaurants, that was a little more, of masks being used. And uh, but overall, in the family fun kind of centers, places like Dave and Buster's, to mention a name brand, but amusement parks are open in Ohio, and it just seems that they are getting much closer to normalcy than we are. And by the way, just for full disclosure, the death per million, and it's every death is tragic. it's sad, but we have to use that metric to track where various states are. Ohio is relatively lower, significantly lower than New Mexico. Neither of them are among the most or the least states in terms of having struggled with the coronavirus, but it's not that Ohio is taking a bunch of gratuitous chances here, so far as we can tell through the data. Now, Wally, much of the balance of this podcast is going to be about the education system and the situation here in New Mexico. And one of the issues that I think a lot of people should be concerned about involves very stark differences in the treatment of private and public schools in the state of New Mexico. And there's a number of news outlets that have reported on the lawsuit that was filed by folks involved with private schools here in New Mexico, being held to a 25% occupancy standard. Public schools, government-run schools are at 50%. And essentially Lujan Grisham is saying, look, I can control and mandate a lot of things going on in these public schools, whereas private schools, I can't. And it really ultimately does seem that this is more about control than any scientific approach that the administration is using. But of course, that's been one of our concerns from day one in terms of Lujan Grisham's management of this crisis. And I don't know if Wally, if you had any thoughts on that lawsuit situation.
Well, we have talked many times about the difference between taking broad measures that are applied consistently across different types of organizations, different types of businesses, versus coming up with these very micromanaged rules that seemingly are very difficult to differentiate between one and the other. And yes, this is another example of the latter, going for a very detailed approach and making differentiations between two types of entities that may or may not be justified based in, I say this slightly tongue in cheek, on the science or the data, is that, what came to the conclusion that that was the way to go. And, there's been very little discussion. There's a lot of differentiation, a lot of differences that are made policy-wise, not much explanation backing them up.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the same seems to be true with regard to traditional public schools as well. There seems to be some stark differences in the way schools in certain parts of our state are being treated as opposed to others. And again, the science is questionable at best. Recently, the PED rated all the various counties green, yellow, and orange and red for the purposes of reopening. And if you look at this map, and it's been reproduced around the state, but the one I have is from the Farmington Daily Times, because this is going to address Farmington in particular. The southeast and the more conservative areas of the state are red, and many of the other areas of the state are green. It's not consistent, across the board, but Chavez County, Eddy County, Lee County, Roosevelt County, Quay County, all in the south and eastern part of the state, by and large, all more conservative areas. Now, there's data points that the governor and her administration have laid out that supposedly justify all this, but those states, or those areas of the state, cannot resume in-person learning at all. The hybrid model, they're being told to go 100% virtual. And then San Juan County, and I got people calling me and telling me what's going on. A brief text I got from somebody up in Farmington. The governor and public education department approved Farmington municipal schools. They're in the green. Then they called a meeting yesterday. This is Thursday. This text was on Friday, when elementary schools were slated to go back to school Tuesday, that's today. Now they said the plan is not approved until at least October. And there's, again, reasons for this, although Farmington and San Juan County up in the northwest corner of our state are in the green. And they, as well as Bloomfield, which is another Four Corners area district, are being told that they have to go virtual for several more weeks. Secretary, the public, the local superintendent, Gene Schmidt, is quoted as saying, "I can't do or say enough to express my disappointment for our schools and community. Even a personal call to advocate on our community's behalf to Secretary Stewart brought no change." I got a similar message from somebody whose wife works in the Moriarty schools, and actually Edgewood School District. They received the final okay from PED that they could open on September 8th to K through 5 students. And then they were subsequently contacted by the PED and told filters in the HVAC systems in the schools in the district were subpar and they would be not allowed to open. It just strikes me, Wally, as this is a very opaque process with a lot of politics being played and real questions about whether the safety of our children and children in these areas in our state or some other ulterior motives is taking precedence here.
Yeah, and what is that? It's one of those, is there just some sort of a punishment in play? Or if there really is some rationale for it, if there is some statistic, if there's some piece of data that we're missing out here, what would be the harm in saying, hey, here's how we're doing it? This is the way.
Yeah, it is very frustrating. Again, right in line with so many of the problems we've had with the governor and her approach to these issues. It does seem that the conservative areas of the state in particular are the ones that are bearing the brunt of kind of the unfair or revised decisions, and suddenly they're finding some reason not to open those districts. And it's not all the conservative areas of the state, and maybe it's not directly based on those areas being targeted. But even regardless of that, it does seem that there is a lot of opaque process in place here that is really questionable. Finally, Wally, and we have kind of a smorgasbord in this podcast with Zach Fort talking about what's going on at Albuquerque City Council. Part of a recent podcast I did with the Cato Institute on the Roswell Air Center, which has gotten some prominence here recently. In the Mark Ronchetti, Ben Ray Lujan race for U.S. Senate, recently Ben Ray Lujan came out and attacked Ronchetti for supporting right to work. And that's obviously a policy that the Rio Grande Foundation has made its bones on in the past with regard to supporting right to work and encouraging policymakers to embrace right to work laws in the state of New Mexico. Unfortunately, back in 2015 and 2016, when they were pushed in the legislature, despite the House being under Republican control, then Senator Majority Leader Michael Sanchez opposed it. But Ben Ray Lujan is attacking Ronchetti for supporting right to work. And while Americans, generally speaking, a strong majority, support unions as a broad concept, the latest polling available, and Gallup stopped doing this poll back in 2014. I suspect it may have been the result of some union pressure to not show such strong support for right to work, because this poll was recently done again on Labor Day weekend. This is kind of the genesis of this whole issue. But in 2014, and right to work is a deeply held issue with people. It doesn't tend to vary very very dramatically. But in 2014, 65% of Democrats supported right to work, and 30% of Democrats opposed it. That's obviously more than 2-to-1 support among Democrats, whose politicians almost uniformly oppose right to work. 77% of independents and 17% of independents support or oppose right to work. So you have huge numbers in independents, even stronger than Republicans, ironically, and 74% of Republicans support right to work, 18% oppose right to work. So very strong support for worker freedom in Republicans and independents as well. But yeah, that's the latest data available, at least from Gallup. Subsequently, other polls have been done. But interestingly, Ben Ray Lujan both won't debate Ron Keddy, so we won't get to hear about this issue unless Ben Ray Lujan has a change of heart. But taking on a challenger on a playing field in which it would seem that the polling data shows that he is in the distinct minority position on the merits of the issue.
Yeah, that is interesting to say the least. That also may be that he is highly, highly confident of his standing in the polls relative to his candidate, Mark Ronchetti, going into the general election here, not that many weeks from now. So yeah, you brought up the point, which is one of the Twitter comments that brought a little smile to my face, is like, well, why don't you bring that up during the debates, which evidently aren't going to happen. And so, yeah, you get to, it's interesting. What has been brought about by social media is a lot of one-way talking points coming out from campaigns. And if there's pushback, it isn't candidate to candidate. In a lot of cases, it's using proxies and others. And here's a pretty good example of that. We won't actually get to see them unless something changes in the very near future on the same stage discussing this issue while they're looking at each other.
Yeah, and unfortunately, given the makeup of the New Mexico legislature these days, right to work is a dead letter in New Mexico. Although the Janus versus AFSCME decision at the federal level, U.S. Supreme Court, gave all government employees the right to opt out of their union. So right to work doesn't directly attack unions. It's not anti-union. It simply means that employees cannot be forced to join a union and pay the union dues as a precondition of being employed at a given place of work. Now, in the case of government agencies, it's really troubling to have some private organization accessing a person's pay before they even get a chance to enjoy that. Now, government employees in New Mexico are right to work. And as we noted on a previous podcast, many state employees are opting out of that union membership for that reason. Private sector workers in New Mexico still can be forced to join a union as a condition of working at that particular workplace. But anyway, that's where we're going to leave it this week. Thanks for listening to this week's show. Make sure to get the latest edition of Tipping Point New Mexico by subscribing at Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and Spotify. You can post or comment on this and other episodes on Facebook and Twitter, and tell Google Home to play Tipping Point New Mexico. Thanks to Path 3 Marketing for producing this show.